Welcome to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I also serve as the administrative director of the Shiloh archaeological excavations in Israel, which are sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research. Now, in the 8th chapter of Mark's Gospel, we read that Jesus healed a blind man in the town of Bethsaida, located somewhere near the Sea of Galilee. For centuries, the exact location of Bethsaida has eluded historians, theologians, and archaeologists. So to help us answer the question, where is Biblical Bethsaida, ABR staff member and pastor of Island Bible Chapel in Ontario, Canada, Bryan Windle, is here to help us answer the question. Welcome back to Digging for Truth, Bryan. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Henry. It's always great to be on the show.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you on. Now, we're getting into a very specific topic today, Bryan. You know, we've talked about all kinds of different discoveries. You've been on the program. We'll talk about top 10 discoveries of this year or that and all-time discoveries. But now we're going to focus particularly on the question of the location of Bethsaida, which I introduced, of course, at the beginning of the program. Why don't you go ahead and introduce our audience to Bethsaida and its connection to Jesus and the Gospels, and let's see where we go with it.
Well, that sounds good. Bethsaida is a really important town in the New Testament. In fact, outside of Jerusalem and Capernaum, it's mentioned more than any other place in the New Testament. And so some significant things happened there. Mentioned by name 7 times, of course. And you mentioned the healing of the blind man happened at Bethsaida in Mark chapter 8. In Luke 9, when the 12 apostles return from the mission trip that Jesus sent them out on, it says that they withdrew to Bethsaida and Jesus performed many healings there, many miracles. Luke chapter 9 also tells us that it was in the vicinity of Bethsaida that Jesus fed the 5,000. And so that significant event happened there as well. Matthew 11, it is one of 3 towns that were specifically named by Jesus when he pronounced woes on them because they had not repented, even though many miracles had been performed there. And finally, in John 1:44, we're told that it was the hometown of Peter and Andrew and Philip. So Jesus spent a lot of time in Bethsaida, spent time there with his disciples. He taught there. He healed many people there. And so it's a pretty significant town in the New Testament. However, it was lost to history at some point. Yeah. We don't exactly know when. Likely around the 3rd century is when we stop having written descriptions of it. And some people have suggested maybe it was the water levels changed in the Sea of Galilee, or an earthquake happened, or some of the geopolitical changes that happened at that particular time. Numerous Jewish villages disappeared about that time. And so we're not sure exactly what caused it to disappear. We just know that it did. And so now archaeologists and scholars are trying to figure out, where is Biblical Bethsaida?
Well, this is going to be fun. It's a little bit of a kind of a CSI kind of thing, and there's a lot of different aspects involved. Of course, the biblical text gives us some general descriptions, but maybe you could begin with some criteria. There's a couple sites that have been identified as potential prospects as being Bethsaida. Maybe we could talk about some of the requirements. It can't be, in the Negev, for example. Obviously, I'm being silly a little bit there, but we're going to get it nailed down a little bit more by talking about geography.
Sure. There are some criteria that any site that claims to be Biblical Bethsaida must meet. And there are, as you mentioned, 2 primary sites that are probably the best candidates that we have right now for Bethsaida. At Tel, for the last 30 years, there have been a group of scholars who have said at Tel is Bethsaida. And another site was identified early on as well, El-Araj, but excavations have only begun there more recently. So we have these 2 sites. And in order to be Biblical Bethsaida, there's a number of criteria that it would have to meet. First of all, geography. It would need to be on the northeastern part shore of the Sea of Galilee. We see in Mark chapter 6 that the disciples get into a boat to go to Bethsaida. So it was clearly on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. When Jesus pronounces his woes on the 3 villages, Chorazin and Capernaum and Bethsaida, that kind of implies they were in fairly close geographic proximity to each other, and those are all on the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee. And finally, we're told in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 17, that the disciples got in a boat to cross over to Capernaum from where the feeding of the 5,000 had happened. And we know from Luke that was somewhere near Bethsaida. So that would imply, if they crossed over, that it would be on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. So that would be the geographic criteria. Topography would be another one. The Bible talks about how the feeding of the 5,000 took place in a desolate area, place where there would be a plain where a lot of people could sit to hear Jesus and to be fed. Josephus writes about the area because he was involved in the area there. He fought some battles near Bethsaida on the plains. So that would be some of the topography. And of course, the big one that we're interested in is the archaeology. What would you expect to find archaeologically at a site that was Biblical Bethsaida? You would probably expect to find some fishing artifacts because Bethsaida literally means house of fish. And so it seems it was a fishing village on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. So you would expect to find some of those. You would expect to find Jewish artifacts because it was a Jewish village. Many Jews there. In fact, when you read the Gospels, you get this idea, this sense that there was a Jewish population from the area that was coming out to see Jesus teach and to hear him and to see him do these miracles. You would expect Roman artifacts. And this is interesting because Josephus tells us that Herod Philip expanded Bethsaida and turned it into a Roman polis. He writes in the Antiquities, he said that Herod provided the village of Bethsaida on the lake Gennesaret with the dignity of a city by increasing the multitude of its inhabitants and by the other honor of naming it Julius. And so we should expect to see then some sort of evidence of urbanization and Roman occupation. And finally, maybe a Byzantine structure, because there was a pilgrim named Willibald who in 725 wrote about going to Bethsaida and seeing a Byzantine church purportedly built over the house of Peter and Andrew. Now, that wouldn't prove that that was Bethsaida. Right. All it would prove is that the Byzantines thought it was Bethsaida, but it would be yet another piece of evidence for that being the location. So you have geography, topography, and archaeology. It would meet those criteria.
Yeah, that's excellent. And this is kind of what we do in our field. You know, we put all the evidence together. Look at the ancient historians. Look at the Byzantine church. I mean, we had a Byzantine church built at the site that we identified as Ai. And we thought maybe they commemorated the site as Ai, and that was a clue that helped us identify it. Well, Bryan, we're wrapping up this segment. We're going to move into our next one in just a moment. We're going to take a break. And folks, please don't go away from this important discussion about Bethsaida in the New Testament. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host Henry Smith, and I'm here today with Bryan Windle. We're here discussing the location of biblical Bethsaida in the New Testament. Where is it? Why is it important? And what kind of clues have been found to help us rediscover this lost city of Bethsaida? Now, Bryan, you were laying out some of the criteria in our first segment. So let's move to the first candidate, the site called El-Araj, which is near the Sea of Galilee. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, El-Araj was first identified as Bethsaida by Edward Robinson, who went through the area and back in the 1800s. And then excavations really began in 1987 under the direction of Dr. Rami Arif and his team. And for the last 30 years, they have been doing excavations. They've uncovered a very large Iron Age city there. And there's some interesting implications about what that might have been, maybe the capital of Geshur, we're not sure. And then they have made the case that is biblical Bethsaida. And in the year 2000, he wrote a very influential article in Biblical Archaeology Review, rather, that he laid out his case for Et-Tel being Bethsaida. It was called Bethsaida Rediscovered, and he believes that it meets the criteria for being biblical Bethsaida.
Well, so 30 years, and then we have an identification in the 19th century, so we got to put the clues together. Robinson thought it was Bethsaida. Let's talk about how it lines up with some of the geography we talked about. Now, I've been to this location, and you can see the Sea of Galilee from it on a clear day, but it's pretty far away from it. And some have pointed out that this is a problem, but nonetheless, we got to evaluate all the evidence. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit. What goes on with that?
Yeah, well, geography, let's start with that. It is located about 1.5 miles, 3 kilometers from the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And that's a bit of a problem for this identification, because how would a fishing village that the Bible says you could get to by boat be located so far away from the shore of the Sea of Galilee? And the excavation team at what they call the Bethsaida Excavation Project at Et-Tel have an explanation for that. They say that it was likely cut off from the shore of the Sea of Galilee by an earthquake that happened sometime in the Common Era. And but what they say is they found right at the base of the Tel, they found clays that contained crustacean microorganisms that had been covered over by by rocks and boulders. And so they say that is evidence that the water at one time came up to the mound at Tel. And it might have come up at one time. We're just not sure exactly when that was. And so they say that it was cut off by this earthquake. Topographically, there are some desolate areas and some plains in the area. It's always hard to know exactly what the topography looked like 2,000 years ago, especially if there was this cataclysmic event that they're talking about. But it would certainly meet that criteria. And of course, the big one for us is the archaeology. And so they have excavated the residential quarter at Et-Tel, and they have found a couple of prominent houses that were built in the earlier era. And so it wasn't quite Roman era. It was in the Hellenistic era. They've named one the winemaker's house because they found a wine cellar with some wine jars. They've named another one the fisherman's house because they found fishing implements in it. And so they were Hellenistic era houses, but they believe they may have been still in use at the time of Jesus. And so they would say there's evidence there. And then they've uncovered another structure that they've identified as a temple, as a Roman temple, that they say was for the imperial cult there. And they said it was repurposed. They found a few fragments of different things, lintels and dressed stone, but there really wasn't a lot left over there. And of course, their theory is that it used to be a temple, used to be a nice temple, but much of the stone was taken to Chorazin, situated about 5 miles away from the site, and repurposed there. So there's not much left at the site. And really, this building that they're identifying as a temple was in a pretty poor state of affairs when they found it. So it's hard to tell. They found some religious objects there, bronze incense shovels and that they say indicates this was a temple. And so they would point to these pieces of evidence as evidence that you could say this is Bethsaida. In fact, Rami Aref has made the bold claim that Et-Tel, in his opinion, contains more evidence for it being Bethsaida than Capernaum, Cana, or Chorazin do for their identification.
Okay. Well, that's a pretty strong statement. We want to take it seriously as we're weighing the evidence, right? We believe Bethsaida existed. It's recorded in the Gospels. But beyond that, the archaeology is debatable. And so, that's something we can sort of put in our minds and work out and see how strongly it holds up. Now, why don't you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges with those interpretations are, what you might call problems with that interpretation, perhaps things someone would say that don't think that it's Bethsaida.
Well, there's always the other side of the picture, right? The other side of the coin. And many scholars, despite 30 years of excavations at Et-Tel, are not convinced that it is Bethsaida. Todd Boland from BiblePlaces.com summarizes the problems with this identification. He says this: there are many problems with the identification of Et-Tel with Bethsaida, including the distance from the Sea of Galilee, the elevation of the site about 20 feet above the level of the lake in ancient times, the lack of remains from the 1st century AD, including significant pottery and coins, and the lack of buildings from the New Testament period. After 30 years of digging, he says, excavators have identified only one Roman period house and another building they identify as a Roman temple, and even this identification is dubious. And so that's a pretty good summary of some of the problems that we have. And so if you kind of dig into them a little bit, 3 kilometers, 1.5 miles from the Sea of Galilee, that's a challenge to overcome. Secondly, the elevation to me is the big one. Rami Aref has argued that the water came up to the base of the Mount of Et-Tel, that it was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee at one time. The other site, El-Araj, is right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and we'll talk about it in our next section. And it shows that there was clear occupation right there, and so the water was not as high as they thought. So this elevation is a problem, because if the water did come up to Et-Tel, El-Araj would have been submerged. And we know from archaeology that it wasn't. And the second problem is urbanization. There just isn't the evidence you would find for urbanization. In fact, using evidence from their own reports, it shows that there was actually, the site shrunk during the Roman era. It didn't expand. Dr. Stephen Notley, who is a historical geographer, has, and we should note, is also involved at the other site, El-Araj, has concluded, he says, the meager state of affairs in the Roman period at Et-Tel stands in irreconcilable conflict with the historical picture of Bethsaida Julius in the 1st century of the Common Era, when Josephus reports the city at its zenith in size and provenance. I mean, even the identification of the temple has been questioned. People saying, we look at other temples at that era, we just don't see the grandeur of a typical temple from the 1st century. And with regards to Aref's contention that the dressed stones and all of the nice stuff from there was taken to Chorazin, people have pointed out that there really is no definitive archaeological evidence at Chorazin for that. And so there are some significant problems with Et-Tel being conclusively identified.
All right. Well, in our next segment, we're going to talk about El-Araj. And folks, don't go away. We'll be right back as we continue our discussion about Bethsaida in the New Testament.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith, and I'm here with Bryan Windle, and we're talking about the location of Bethsaida in the New Testament. Now, Bryan, we left off talking about the one site, Et-Tel. Let's talk about El-Araj, which is the one that's closer to the shore. It's being excavated now. Please share with the audience some of the evidence that looks like it points to being Bethsaida.
That's right. Excavations have started there, and they're uncovering some pretty exciting things that would seem to indicate that we might be on the right track now for it being Biblical Bethsaida. Geographically, it's right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's only about 600 feet inland. Topographically, it's in the same area as Et-Tel, and so similar plains and desolate areas. But archaeologically, this is where things get really exciting. As they have dug, they went through the Byzantine era, Byzantine layer, went right down. They found a layer of silt, and underneath that layer of silt, they found Roman era remains there, indicating that there was a village. They found pottery. They found a coin from the Emperor Nero, and so clearly evidence of structures there as well, including fishing implements, many fishing implements they've found there, hundreds of fishing weights. And this past year, they even found a mold, a chalkstone mold for a fishing weight there. And so it's pretty clear that it was occupied in the 1st century. They found knife-paired Herodian oil lamps there as well. And so all of this would indicate a presence, and even a Jewish presence, there in the 1st century. They also have found Roman remains. In 2017, they uncovered part of a Roman bathhouse. And so they had Roman bricks, tesserae, a partially intact mosaic, broken clay tubuli, all indicating that it was a Roman polis, because you generally don't have Roman bathhouses in Jewish fishing villages. And finally, in 2019, it was really exciting. They uncovered a Byzantine structure with some amazing mosaics, and they came out and have concluded that they are uncovering a church. Possibly even the church that Willibald described in 725 as being the church of the apostles, the church built over top of the home of Peter and Andrew. And so all of this is coming together to say, hey, this site was occupied, and it seems to be matching the criteria.
Yeah, I think the audience could pick up on the fact kind of where you feel the evidence leads us. It leads us more in the direction of El-Araj, and not that we're eliminating Et-Tel, but because El-Araj had not been excavated previously, it was hard to adjudicate the evidence. It was hard to weigh it. So you had to be more tentative about it. But this seems to point more in that direction. You would expect more occupation there too, the way the Bible seems to describe it. Like an active fishing village would have pottery from the 1st century, which El-Araj does, and so on, the things that you describe. Now, any problems with the identification? What might be missing? And we give you about a minute and a half for that part of it, Bryan.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, with Rami Aref having excavated at Et-Tel for 30 years, and now have El-Araj starting to make finds and making some claims, people thinking that might be Bethsaida, he's raised a couple of things. He at first said there's no evidence of occupation there in the Roman era. He said he did a shovel survey, that all they found was Byzantine remains. Well, now we know that there were actual Roman remains. He himself admits that now. And he says, though, that it was the site was a camp from a Roman military group of mercenaries. That's what he believes it was. And some have said it's too small to be El-Araj. And so the excavation team there in 2018 went 50 meters to the east and did a square there, and they found Roman remains. And then in 2019, they went 100 meters to the north and found more Roman remains. And so what they're trying to show is that it wasn't just a small site, it was a fairly significant site. And the only other one is people have said, let's just be careful about the identification of the Byzantine structure. Just because you find a mosaic doesn't mean you have found a Byzantine church. We need to excavate it and find the structure. Is the telltale apse there, for example? And the excavation team at El-Araj, Stephen Notley told me that they are planning to excavate that structure fully in the coming season. So there's some really promising things there. The excavations are still in their infancy, though, and so we just have to wait to see what else comes out of the ground.
Okay. Well, Bryan, we got about 45 seconds left, and instead of sort of talking more about the archaeology, I thought you could summarize in 45 seconds. This sounds like a pointy-headed discussion about archaeology. Why is this important?
Well, it's important because, number one, it's a significant New Testament site. And so that's something that we need to consider. And number two, it provides some of the background for us. One of the reasons we do archaeology is that it provides the background that helps us understand in better detail the biblical text. And finally, it's really important because it helps us by affirming what is written in the biblical text. And what we're seeing, particularly at El-Araj, for example, is that a lot of the things that they're discovering in their excavations are lining up with what we know of the site from Scripture.
Amen to that. Well, Bryan, thank you for being so thorough, so well communicating with our audience. You do an excellent job. It's a privilege to serve the Lord with you and have you on Digging for Truth.
Thanks, Henry. It's great to be with you.
All right, folks, thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth and exploring the location of Biblical Bethsaida.